This time Johnny brought me 20 nail clippers and came up with another crazy challenge. He asked me if I could turn these ordinary nail clippers into something that would surprise everyone. Of course, I accepted the challenge. First, I built a steel container large enough to hold all 20 nail clippers. I packed them tightly inside one by one and compressed everything firmly with a hammer. But there were still empty spaces between them, so I filled every remaining gap with steel powder until the container was completely packed. Then I sealed the container and headed outside to my charcoal forge. I fired up the forge and placed the container deep into the hot coals. After letting it heat for a while, the container became extremely hot. I carefully started hammering it from every side, using controlled blows to compress everything evenly. After some time, I could feel through the hammer that the nail clippers inside had fused together into one solid mass. At that point, I shut down the forge and allowed the container to cool. Once it was cold, I used an angle grinder to cut off the ends and slice open one side of the container. Then I peeled away the outer shell and removed the solid steel billet from inside. I welded a long handle onto the billet so I could forge it more easily, fired up the forge again, and started hammering. This time, I could use much heavier blows. I worked from morning until evening without stopping. First, I drew out the billet and flattened the entire piece into a plate approximately 4 millimeters thick. And as you already know, I do all of this by hand. No hydraulic press, no power hammer. That makes this kind of forging extremely difficult and exhausting. Finally, I forged the blade tip and shaped the tang where the handle would later be attached. By the end of the day, this was what the rough forged piece looked like, but there was still a lot of work ahead. The next morning, I started at the belt grinder. First, I leveled both sides to remove the uneven surfaces and hammer marks left from forging. Then I began refining the contours until the piece finally started taking the shape of a knife. Once the profile was finished, I immediately moved on to one of the most difficult stages, grinding the bevels. I always say that this is one of the most important steps in knife making. The bevels determine not only how beautiful the finished blade will look, but also how well it will actually perform when cutting. After carefully finishing both bevels, I sanded the entire blade to 180 grit. This removed the deeper scratches left behind by the coarse belts during grinding. Next, I marked the positions for the bolster and handle and drilled all the necessary holes. Then I fired up my forge once again. I heated the blade to approximately 850 degrees Celsius and quickly quenched it in oil. Now the steel was hardened and much stronger. After heat treatment, I continued sanding exactly where I had stopped. Starting at 180 grit, I gradually worked my way all the way up to 2000 grit. Then I thoroughly washed the blade and placed it into ferric chloride for several minutes. I removed it, rinsed the blade, and placed it back into the ferric chloride once again. And finally, the pattern I had been waiting to see appeared across the blade. Just look at that texture. Now it was time to make the bolster. For this part, I almost always choose brass. I prepared 2 small brass plates, drilled them to size, and attached them to both sides of the blade using 2 pins. Then I carefully peened the pins with a hammer until both brass pieces were locked firmly in place. For the handle, I chose 2 pieces of my favorite Greek walnut. I drew the handle shape onto the wood and shaped both scales on the belt grinder. Then I drilled the holes and attached everything using epoxy and 2 brass pins. I left the handle to cure overnight. The next day, once the epoxy had fully hardened, I returned to the belt grinder and finished shaping the handle. Then I switched to hand sanding and worked the entire wooden handle to 220 grit. Finally, it was time for the protective wax. I applied the wax to the walnut, which immediately brought out its beautiful natural color while also helping protect the wood from moisture. Then I sharpened the blade, and this is the final result. From 20 ordinary nail clippers to a beautiful little Damascus knife. If you think I won this challenge too, make sure to subscribe to my channel.